Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on behalf of REL Northwest, the Institute of Education Sciences, and the Council of Chief State School Officers. We are excited to have folks from the entire nation, East Coast, all the way to Hawaii, and even folks in Africa and Asia. So today you will be hearing from Dan Goldhaber on evaluation systems and what the research says, and then you'll be hearing from Michelle Hudacsko and Havila Hansen on gathering and using data to know what's working. Now, this is a 1 hour long webinar. You're not going to hear about everything there is to know. We're going to give some examples. So, for example, Dan is going to talk about teacher evaluation, but there's certainly a lot of lessons that will be applicable to other school personnel. Dan is also going to mention the V word a couple of times, value added, but there will still be a lot of relevant information for you guys who are using other measures of student learning and growth or who are not using measures of student learning and growth in your systems. And finally, Michelle and Havila are going to discuss an example of a large urban school district. And here again, there'll be a lot of information that we can use or that we can adapt for districts and other circumstances. And you're not alone to do that. We are the REL Northwest, and we are one of 10 regional organizations around the nation. And our job is to serve the districts and states in our region and to help them make the best use of data and research and best practice to design and implement and monitor pretty much anything you want around education. So there are opportunities for us to collaborate in the near future around educator evaluations and their monitoring. I'll be in touch with folks that I know, but please feel free to reach out to us after this webinar so we can talk about possibilities to collaborate. Now, a little bit on logistics. We have received some questions in advance. Please also send questions in the chat box. We will respond to some time permitting, but we will definitely post responses to all the answers on our website, so along with additional resources. And one more thing, following this webinar, you will receive an evaluation email. Please take the time to complete this survey, as we also want to evaluate and improve our work, and your feedback would be very helpful. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Dan Goldhaber.
Hi, Ella. It's nice to be here. Nice to meet you all, so to speak. So as Ella mentioned, I'm going to use the V word, value added, but I really do want to emphasize that in talking about educator evaluation, I'm only using value added because we know a good deal about how teachers compare to one another and evaluation systems in the context of value added, but I think that everything that I'm going to say really applies more generally to different ways that one might evaluate teachers. So I want to begin with a little bit of context. And the context is that we now know empirically that teachers matter a great deal for student achievement. And this is, I think this is probably common sense to most parents and people who have been in schools, but there's now a good deal of empirical evidence suggesting that, there are big differences between teachers, and those differences show up in terms of student achievement on standardized tests, and they also show up for longer-term outcomes like the probability that students graduate from high school, go on to college, or their labor market earnings and labor market participation. And unfortunately, school system human resource management policies, those are both, I guess, state system and district systems, generally fail to recognize and act on the differences that exist between teachers. So I think this is a really important topic because, to me, basically any kind of acting on the differences that we know exist between teachers has to start with differences in evaluation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the evaluations that typically happen today and what we know about those. As I mentioned, value-added is one option, but it certainly need not be the only one. The reason that people tend to focus on value-added is, as I'll describe, in most cases, the other ways that teachers are evaluated show that all teachers are the same. And so you can't act on differences if the evaluation suggests that there are no differences. So I want to begin by just sort of giving you a benchmark for how important teachers are. When we evaluate teachers based on value-added, again, this is a statistical measure of their contribution to student learning growth on standardized tests. It appears that they're the most important of the factors over which schools have direct control. There's obviously a lot that goes on in the home and the environment that kids grow up in that influences the amount that they learn in reading, math, and other subjects. But in terms of schooling variables, it looks like teacher differences between teachers is one of the most important components. So again, just to give you a feel for how much that matters, the difference between a teacher that is in the middle of the distribution, so sort of an average teacher of effectiveness, and a teacher who is a standard deviation more effective than a teacher in the middle or at the 84th percentile. There are estimates to suggest that differential is roughly equivalent to the difference in student achievement that you would see if you were to lower class sizes by 10 to 13 students. Now, typically the differences that we see between teachers, they're not strongly connected to the policies that we use to determine employment eligibility, that's licensure, and reward teachers in terms of their compensation, degree, and experience level. And I want to give you a picture of that. I'm actually going to skip over this slide. Here's a picture from some work in North Carolina, and this is looking at teacher performance on licensure tests. And what I've got here is kind of the familiar bell curve. So you might have seen this in the context of, individual heights, where the horizontal axis here is a measure of teacher performance, a value-added measure of teacher performance. But, it could be the height of men and women, and the different distributions show the performance of teachers who passed required licensure tests in North Carolina. This is the solid line underneath the solid line, and the teachers who failed to pass the required licensure test, which is the dotted line. Now, if you are going to judge which teachers are likely to be more effective, it's the teachers that passed. The mean of the distribution for the solid line, which is just above 0, 0 being the average teacher effectiveness, is higher than the mean of the distribution for teachers who failed the test. But the point here is that there's a lot of overlap in these distributions. So it turns out that all of the teachers that are in Area B, those are teachers that failed to pass, these required tests, but turn out to be more effective than the average teacher who passed the test. And all the teachers in Area A are teachers that pass the test, but turn out to be less effective than the teachers who fail. So while teacher licensure performance is predictive of student achievement, it's not wildly predictive. You wouldn't want to bet your house that a teacher who passed a test was more effective than a teacher who failed. And if I was to draw these same sort of pictures for looking, say, a novice teacher versus a teacher with 5 or more years of experience, it would look pretty comparable. And if you draw this picture for master's degrees, there's almost complete overlap in these distributions, suggesting that master's degrees really have very little predictive validity in terms of student achievement. So, for those reasons, people are thinking about using educator evaluations for some of these kinds of policies, thinking about, who should be in the workforce, thinking about how they should be paid, maybe thinking about the kind of professional development they get, and whether they get promoted into more leadership positions, say as a mentor teacher. Generally, our policies for in-service teachers, they don't differentiate teachers. So, perhaps it's political, perhaps it's just cultural. But if you look at most school systems and the kind of evaluations that teachers are given, they generally are deemed by people who go in and look qualitatively, they're deemed to be weak. And as I mentioned before, when you actually look at the evaluations themselves and the distribution of evaluations, they tend to show that almost all teachers get the same rating. So as a particular, this was sort of made famous by a report called the Widget Report that looked at a variety of different districts and the distribution of evaluations in those districts. But kind of more to our region, there was a survey that was done in Washington State a couple of years back, and they showed that all 99.1% of teachers got the same evaluation. They were all rated as satisfactory. Now, at that time in Washington State, school districts were generally using this binary method of evaluating teachers who were satisfactory or unsatisfactory, so it looked like there wasn't much room for nuance. But even when school systems seem to transition into educator evaluation systems that allow for more nuance, 4 or 5 tiered systems, they tend to show that most teachers are clustered right at the top. So if all teachers are judged to be the same, you can't use the evaluation. So again, I want to emphasize that any way that you'd want to act on the evaluations, you have to have differentiation. And again, that's why economists and a lot of education researchers tend to rely on value added, because it forces a distribution. If you are looking at classroom observations and everyone is rated the same, you can't use that to evaluate what's going on in schools. So how might educator evaluation systems be used? Well, you could really think about using them to affect, all different aspects of the teacher pipeline. In terms of teacher training, one could think about feedback loops where teacher training programs are trying to figure out, based on the performance evaluations of teachers out in the field, well, what makes for effective training, and modifying programs based on that. And there's actually quite a lot of interest in this area right now, both in terms of using value-added and other means of assessing teacher training programs. School systems could use evaluations to try and figure out, well, what kind of characteristics ought we to look for in applicants? Do we see that teachers who have particular kinds of characteristics or dispositions seem to ultimately be more effective when we hire them? Certainly, there's a great deal of interest, that's been spurred on by the Race to the Top initiative and in some cases the NCLB waiver policy to use performance of in-service teachers to inform things like professional development, performance incentives, staffing policies. And then finally, kind of the highest of the high stakes use would be using teacher performance evaluations to make decisions basically about who is allowed to remain in the teacher workforce. And we don't see that so much in the Pacific Northwest, but that is a big part of the experiment that you see in some of the states back east that have won Race to the Top grants. We know a fair bit about the way that performance incentives affect teachers, and we don't know much about the way that using individual evaluations to inform professional development affects teachers. But what we do know about professional development is that, by and large, it doesn't look like it's very effective. And one of the hypotheses about why it might not be very effective is because it tends to be pretty generic. and so that it's not typically the case that a teacher gets an evaluation, the evaluation identifies areas of strengths or weaknesses, and then the professional development that they receive is tailored to those specific strengths and weaknesses. Generally, professional development, it's delivered in various ways, but it tends to apply to teachers in general as opposed to being specifically tailored to their individual needs. There is a suggestion when it comes to thinking about using performance evaluations to inform, the workforce, who is employed or not employed, what kinds of students are they teaching, and how large are their classes, that there could be really big gains associated with using performance evaluations to inform some of those staffing policies, but there's not much in the way of empirical analysis about that topic because, as I mentioned, most school systems really haven't differentiated their performance evaluations very much, and because most school systems are not using them for those purposes today, although there are plans to do so. There are a variety of different ways that one can evaluate teachers. I've mentioned value-added. Classroom observations are pretty prevalent. We know a lot about value-added and very little about some of the other ways that teachers can be evaluated in terms of the properties of those evaluations. My take on some of the controversies about value-added is that they aren't really about value-added per se, but they're more about the high-stakes use of teacher performance evaluations and how these systems ought to be used and the degree to which the performance evaluation actually differentiates teachers and puts them into different performance categories. So I'm getting to the wrap-up point, but in terms of evaluation systems, the lack of differentiation really hampers any use of the evaluations. Basically, if you can't document what's going on, then you can't defend the way that you're treating teachers. You can't connect it to their evaluation. I would argue that it's useful to have multiple ways of evaluation, and the reason I would argue is that it's both good to get at different dimensions of teacher performance and the different ways that teachers might be evaluated might address the different dimensions, but also because the different types of teacher evaluation might have different salience to teachers and different face validity, and also might provide different types of feedback. So, teachers are often a little bit distrustful about value added and using student growth as a measure. The nice thing about that measure is that it's the measure that schools are using to or that schools are being judged by, and that it's objective, but it doesn't give teachers concrete feedback about what they might do to improve. On the other hand, one might argue that another way that teachers be evaluated based on the perceptions of them, there are these student perception surveys that some districts are administering, that might be very salient to teachers, that they care about what their students think of them, and that providing the feedback from their students could really matter and inform teacher behavior in a way that some other types of evaluation would not. I think that when you are thinking about evaluation reform, that you need to ask some key questions to figure out what an evaluation system ought to look like. One is, how do stakeholders interpret the evaluation, and will evaluation change practices? What will the system be used for? That ought to inform the kind of issues that come up around system design. So is it just about informing professional development? Do you want to use it for high stakes purposes? When do teachers need to get feedback, et cetera? And then finally, especially in the case of high stakes use of evaluations, it's probably necessary to make sure that you build checks into the system to make sure that the evaluation is working as intended and that there's not sort of manipulation in the system You know, for instance, if teachers are being evaluated based on a particular classroom rubric, you'd want to make sure that they aren't just exhibiting certain kinds of teaching practices on the day that they're required to be evaluated, or, you know, what we've seen elsewhere when people have used value-added, that teachers aren't manipulating student achievement tests to show that their students are making outsized growth. So I think that there are a lot of other systems that one would want to connect to the evaluation system, the performance feedback mechanism, you know, data, and then sort of audit kind of mechanisms to make sure that the evaluation system is set in a context in which you would expect it to work well. So I want to just conclude by saying, and I've basically sort of said this in my remarks already, that you want to think clearly about the theory of action and the way that you want to use the evaluation, because that should help inform the design. And then secondly, I think that in thinking about evaluations, you don't want to get tied up too much in thinking about a particular means of evaluation before you get into the debate about how the evaluation is going to be used. Because my read, again, on some of the debates that you see right now focused on value-added is that they're really not about value-added per se, but they are about the degree to which teachers are going to be differentiated and the stakes that are going to be attached to those differences. And then the last thing I would say is that I think that we'll know a lot more about teacher evaluation and educator evaluation in general, so the evaluation of principals too, when we see Race to the Top sort of fully implemented and studies coming out of it. But I also think for school systems that are thinking about evaluation reform, that they want to think carefully about how they're going to evaluate the system and not think that the implementation of a new system is sort of the end, rather that it's the beginning of a process of hopefully continual improvement where, you know, you assess how well it's working and maybe tweak it as you go forward. So let me conclude there and turn the presentation over.
Thank you, Dan. So since we have a little bit of time, I'm going to go ahead and ask you a question or two that have come up. And one follows on one of the last things you said about multiple methods of evaluation being necessary. So do you have any advice on combining multiple measures of educator effectiveness, particularly when some measures are normative and others are criteria-based?
Yeah, so I guess I would say I think the first thing to think about is, what do you value as the outcome? The recent Measures of Effective Teaching study, which you can get from the Gates Foundation, there's actually a whole series of reports, but they show that the kind of evaluation system that you want to use and the degree that you want to apply different weights to the different means of evaluating teachers is going to depend, you know, on the outcome that you value. So if you really value, for instance, student achievement on state assessments, then if you were combining multiple measures, you would weight value-added relatively highly. If you really value certain teaching practices, then, you know, it's probably no surprise that you would tend to weight practices highly, because ultimately what we're doing when we're evaluating teachers and giving them these performance evaluations is we're making judgments about what we anticipate about future performance. And so what the MET study does is it says, how would the prediction of performance today, or how well does the estimate of performance today predict outcomes of teacher effectiveness tomorrow? And what the study shows, again, is that the way that you create optimal weights for the different methods depends on what objective you're trying to achieve in terms of teacher effectiveness tomorrow. So that is, I guess, the first point. And then the second thing I would say about combining different methods is that it's possible that combining is not necessarily what you want to do. So lots of states are weighting different evaluations or different means of evaluating teachers, but weighting different evaluation processes is not the only option. So one could, for instance, use one process as a screening device. So, value added, for instance, and say, okay, value added says that here are the teachers that are at the, the top of the distribution, and here are the teachers at the bottom of the distribution. We're going to really concentrate on the top to say we're going to look closely and see which teachers, at the top might merit, performance bonuses. Or we're going to really look at the teachers at the bottom and see, based on classroom observations, which teachers really need help in terms of professional development or mentoring. So there are other ways that you could use evaluations that does not necessarily involve combining them. And I would reference a paper that was done for the Carnegie Foundation for Advancement of Teaching by Doug Harris that talks about, the issue of combining different methods versus using the methods in different sequence.
Great, thank you, Dan. So we will now move on to hearing from a practitioner. So I will hand it over to Havala Hansen and Michelle Hudacsko.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to welcome Michelle Hudacsko from DC Public Schools. Michelle, we are making you the presenter right now. And could you tell us a little bit about the design of your evaluation system in DC and what its goals were? I think you're still on mute.
Well, I think while we try to get Michelle back, why don't I go ahead and ask Dan another question then. So something just came up about, you were talking about having to think about the purpose of what you want to do with these evaluations. So one question that came up is VAM appropriate and reliable for evaluating teacher education programs?
So appropriate and reliable is a little bit in the eye of the beholder. I think that there are a lot of complexities that come up with doing evaluating teacher preparation programs based on any measure of performance of in-service teachers, be it value-added or, any other measure of performance of in-service teachers. But to me, the question is, you can't sort of take the question totally in the abstract. You have to think about it in the context of the way that teacher preparation programs are currently being evaluated. So in most, if not all states, the way that is done is that there's a team of folks, generally from Professional Educator Standards Bureau or the equivalent in other states, that go out and they review the curriculum in the program, and they talk to the professors about what's going on, and they make some somewhat subjective judgments about whether it is meeting standard. I think that there's a value to doing that, but I also think that that's imperfect. So again, this is Dan's opinion. It's not buttressed necessarily by empirical evidence, but I do believe that there is merit to judging teacher preparation programs based on their output. So how effective are the teachers that ultimately end up in the profession? How long do they stay? And that there's a lot more detail behind that statement. I would also ask people to go and take a look at the Carnegie Advancement for Teaching Knowledge Network briefs, because I did one of these on this very topic. But the big point is that you wouldn't want to evaluate appropriate or not appropriate in the abstract. You want to think about evaluation, one type of evaluation, relative to all the other types of evaluation that are out there and possible.
Great, thank you, Dan. So I think we're ready for Michelle?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Could you tell us a little about the system in DC and its goals?
Absolutely. I first was going to say thank you to folks for joining today and for the opportunity to talk with you about what we're doing here in Washington, D.C. So we began our work, and really with teacher evaluation being the core of that work, back in 2007 as we reflected on the proficiency rates of students in DCPS. And as you can see, back in 2007, we had only really about 10% of our students in the 8th grade reading proficiently, yet much like Dan had been talking about, all of our teachers were being rated the same. Nearly 100% of our teachers, we were telling them that they were meeting or exceeding our expectations. And so two real big problems there. First, of course, is the disconnect between kids' outcomes and the message we're sending to adults. But then also, we couldn't do anything with that data when everyone is rated the same. And so what was important to us was to develop a performance assessment system that had really clear expectations and differentiated relevant feedback for staff members. That was also a tool for growth and development, in addition to providing us a clear distribution of performance of our force. And then once we had that identification of performance, to know who was doing really great work so that we could leverage them, and then also who was a low performer that may not be the right fit for our system and for the type of work we need to do with our students. And so we developed Impact then in 2009 with the one big goal is to create a system in which any parent in the city would be satisfied randomly assigning their child to any classroom. That's certainly not where we were, and it's actually still not where we are today, but we're definitely headed in the right direction, and Impact has been an important part of that. It has allowed us to reward and retain and recognize our best teachers, to provide support and grow those teachers who need it, and then transition out our lower performers. Impact has iterated quite a bit over the last 6 to 7 years. And for the first 2 years of the work, it really was about research and design, reaching out to universities, to researchers, to other school districts, to teachers, the community, parents. We did that for over a year and then spent the next year designing rubrics as well as the system overall. And in 2009, launched the first iteration of Impact. And then for the last 5 years, Impact has iterated each year, and you can see that at 2 other points in the last 5 years, we've had significant changes to the system. So after the first year, we made significant changes from Impact 1.0 to 2.0, which we fondly call it. And then in 2012, made more significant changes, especially around the Common Core, for Impact 3.0. The iterations between those larger overhauls have also been, though, very important because of consistency for teachers and staff members and understanding what's expected of them, and opportunities for us to gather more feedback to think about what's next for the system.
Thanks, Michelle. It looks like you've put in a tremendous amount of work into the system, and like you said, you've had a lot of iterations of it. So how do you know what's working and what's not?
Absolutely. Well, there's a number of ways we do that, and most importantly, we ask people directly. So as we thought about our most recent overhaul of the system, we engaged with multiple different kinds of stakeholders, and I've got some examples of them here for you guys to see. Importantly, we met with school leaders who represented different experience levels, school types and wards, which are the neighborhoods in DC. School leaders really implement the bulk of Impact. They do the heavy lift, and hearing from them what was working and not working for Impact to be a staff management tool in their schools was critical. We also, though, reached out to teachers and staff members and heard back from hundreds of teachers across the system. We led feedback sessions across the district, as well as feedback sessions for folks in central office who help to manage the system here. Each of our principals is managed by an instructional superintendent, and we met one-on-one with them over the course of a year to discuss changes and to get feedback. And then we also met closely with the Washington Teachers Union regularly throughout the year to get their feedback because they obviously are connected with their members as well. Another way that we know that this is working is based on the implementation and what that tells us. When we see that something is harder to do, we know that we need to streamline something or change a particular procedure. So, for example, we use student learning objectives as one of the options for a student achievement metric. And we look at every single one for every teacher in the district. So we're looking at 10,000 plus goals to ensure that they are valid goals. We realized this was a big lift for teachers to write these goals, for principals to approve, and then for us to do final approval. And so now for some of our more standardized assessments, although not our state assessment, but more off-the-shelf standard assessments, we were able to pre-populate those goals into our database to save time there. Or there are elements of the evaluation system which require certain types of documentation around attendance or tardies, and we have fields in our database that actually call out submission of that information. And then finally, I feel like most importantly, one of the ways that we know the system is working is the data on the growth of our teachers. And we can talk a little bit more about this at the end, but each year we see significant improvement in the performance of our teachers based on their final impact rating. And this could be attributed to a number of elements of the evaluation system. At the most basic, that there is a common language for talking about instruction that wasn't present in DCPS anymore. People know what the standards are, they know what the expectations that they're being held to, and they receive 5 observations a year to give them ongoing feedback to support their growth. And we're able to connect other elements of our district's professional development to our evaluation system to support that growth. So we really are seeing across the spectrum of performance, impact helps lower performers get better, as well as our higher performers get better as well.
Great. What lessons have you learned that you can share with other districts who are designing and implementing new evaluation systems around implementing them and monitoring them for their effectiveness and revising them?
Yeah, I want to talk about 2 things here. One, just some lessons learned that are granular about some of the changes that we've made, and then I'll generalize to some larger lessons learned. So as we talked about all of this type of input that we receive from stakeholders, I think one of the most important lessons learned is to listen and to iterate, to understand that while it's important to be decisive about decisions and know your values that you're trying to get out there with your system, that you also need to be flexible and nimble. So for example, we have made significant changes over the last couple of years. I know we've talked a bit about value added. It's something that DCPS values tremendously and has been part of impact since its inception. But for our 3.0 version of impact, we actually reduced the percentage of value added in this subset of teachers' evaluations in response to 3 themes of feedback. One, and I saw one of the questions that popped up in the Q&A, is our state test is not something, does not provide data that teachers can use to grow their own performance. The data isn't available until school is out, and we also recognize it's not a comprehensive measure. We also knew that it was hard to understand and therefore could be stressful. So while it's still a part of the system, we listened to teachers and changed its weight. We've also created differentiated observations to respond to teacher stress. We know we need less observations for our higher performing teachers. We knew our newer teachers needed support earlier on. And this also responded to feedback from our administrators that they would benefit from a reduction in their workload. And then we've also done things such as when teachers are observed, if they have an outlier score, something that is significantly lower than the other scores that they receive throughout the year, we drop that score. And we did that in response to comments that teachers were sometimes hesitant to try something new or felt that our system wasn't cognizant of the fact that human beings have bad days. So those types of things are a response to feedback. But we've also made some structural changes based on data, not necessarily direct feedback. And this goes again to what Dan was saying about ensuring that your system really can differentiate your performance levels. When we started Impact, and for the first 3 years, we used to have 4 ratings categories that defined effectiveness. Now we have 5. After gathering data over several years, we found that our category labeled effective was simply too broad, and the effectiveness of our teachers at the bottom of that category versus those at the top was dramatically different. The researchers that we work with to evaluate impact were showing us it was 6 to 8 months of math and reading learning. So now we have an additional category in there as well. So some of those pieces are just based on feedback, but I would say that we have 5 big lessons learned over the last 5 years. And the first really is that our system, by setting these high expectations and collecting robust teacher performance data, it truly has been transformative for the district. Initially, we could not distinguish who our teachers are. Now we know who they are. We know how to support them. We can make smart human capital decisions. And so being really thoughtful about how you're designing a system to meet that goal is critical. That being said, I will say a lesson learned here is to launch a system that has very clear co-goals. I think everyone knew that impact was going to be a tool to have a clear distribution of performance. But I don't think the message that came out as clearly in those first couple of years of impact, I'm sure many could attest based on news articles and things, was that it was also a tool for growth. And we've seen it serve in that way, but that's not always been the feeling of teachers here in the district. So I think that's really important as people are thinking about launching a system to think about ways that those two things can be done together. The second real lesson is that implementation is everything. In DCPS, we do get 100% compliance with impact. So our principals know that this is a top priority in the district, and our assessments are completed. We have 4,000 teachers, and they each receive up to 5 evaluations a year. We just don't miss those metrics, but that's because we have invested in operations. So we have 6 full-time staff members that handle the operations here in central office. For our district, which is small, it's close to $2 million that we spend on the operating costs, whether that's our database, staff, things like that. We have phone and helplines, which are taken all day, hundreds of emails a week from teachers, from principals, and we offer over 300 hours of trainings a year for people to understand how impact works, the expectations that they're being held to. I think an important lesson, a nuanced lesson, though, here within implementation, though, is while compliance is critical, so is quality implementation. And I think that's a piece that we've focused very heavily on 100% completion, which is critical for the credibility of the system. But here in years 3, 4, 5, we've kind of taken a step back and worked on increasing the quality, for example, of written reports, or ensuring that all evaluators have a fully normed interpretation of our rubric. And that's challenging to not do that from the onset. So that's an important piece to keep in mind. The third, as folks are thinking about this, is just that evaluation is stressful for teachers, and no communication strategy can fix that entirely. It is not uncommon for us to hear from teachers, impact is stressful. I never know when someone's going to walk into my classroom to evaluate me. So these reforms are radical changes for the way that we think about the teaching profession, and it takes some time for teachers to feel comfortable with them. There are a variety of ways that we've worked to address this over the last couple of years, but I'd be remiss if I suggested that every teacher in DCPS is comfortable with impact at this point. But we do hold ongoing feedback sessions each year. As I mentioned before, we now have fewer observations for our highest performers. We offer the opportunity for a teacher after an observation to input information into a context box for an observer to learn something that might have been happening in the classroom right before they came in for the observation. We focus on relationship building between our teachers and our external evaluators, the peer observers, who are folks that just simply don't have opportunity to build relationships. We now do informal observations so that teachers can get feedback before something is part of the high stakes evaluation. And we also now tie impact ratings to our teacher career ladder so the teachers can really see incentives and benefits based on their performance. The fourth lesson is around stakeholder input, and I know we talked a lot about earlier about how much feedback we seek to gather, but it's also important that to realize it can only get you so far. So you really need to be clear as a system about your values, your goals, and be ready for the challenges of changing that. You know, for example, we would go to some focus groups and hear, I really want someone other than my principal to observe me. I want an objective external evaluator who knows my content area. And then at the next meeting we might hear, I really don't trust outsiders to observe me. Or we hear, teamwork is really important, and you know, that's part of being a teacher and being in education. And then you'll hear in the next meeting, I should really only be evaluated on the things that I do. You know, why should my score be in any way impacted by others in my building? Or student achievement is the most important thing, or student achievement shouldn't be part of my evaluation. So it's just important to know that you will get pushback and be open to feedback, but also know that you're not going to please everyone. And then finally, I think this has been really important in DC because impact has gotten so much press, but that evaluation is a foundation, but it really must be part of a broader human capital strategy. You know, people might have perceptions about the system, but you can't fire your way to an effective force, and it really needs to be part of a larger theory of action. And here in DCPS, it's about recruiting and selecting the best possible talent to come here to DC, doing the types of things that need to happen to set folks up for success, then rigorously evaluate performance in order to retain and extend the reach of our best folks, provide targeted support, and then remove ineffective as needed. And that all of those things together will increase student achievement, but it can't be something that's done solely in isolation. So those are lessons learned after 5 years. Happy to answer any questions that folks might have, and certainly happy to be able to have the chance to share some of those hindsight is 20/20 things that it might have been nice that if we had known ourselves 5 years ago. I'm sorry, do you want me just to do this last thing about some of the research here?
Absolutely.
Okay. And so we are fortunate enough to have a partnership with Stanford and UVA, and they were put out a study a couple of months ago about, you know, is impact working? Because a lot of these things, of course, are from our own perspective. And three big highlights. The first is, as I mentioned before, impact is causing teachers to improve at performance levels across the spectrum. Two, and this is very exciting, is that impact is not scaring away our best teachers. We're able right now to retain our very best teachers at very high rates. So 92% of the teachers that we say are the best of the best are retained each year, while in contrast, we're only retaining about 60% of the teachers with whom we have concerns, who are not meeting our expectations. And that's the kind of differentiated retention that we're really excited about. And then third, and it's sort of related to the retention piece, is that by having these really clear expectations, impact does cause many of our lower performing teachers to simply leave on their own. and that we are then able to replace them with teachers who are substantially outperforming the ones who choose to resign. So our replacement value is helping to really increase the effectiveness of our force overall. So we're excited to see this. So this is certainly from an inputs and a teacher's perspective, and probably folks have seen, or hopefully have seen in the news in the last couple of months, NAEP scores. While we have a tremendous way to go here in DCPS, we are making tremendous growth for our students, and we're confident that the effectiveness, the increased effectiveness of our educators is closely related to that. So I will turn that back to you then.
Yes, thank you. So there's one very specific question that I think you could help with. One of the major areas of concern is how do you do this for special education teachers? So how are you addressing special education teachers, and what is your evidence that the approach you have taken is a valid one?
Sure. I think a general philosophy in DCPS is that our students who have special needs deserve the best teachers in order to be able to really meet their needs and accelerate their growth. So our special education teachers are assessed using the same type of measures as our general education teachers. I want to clarify, though, value added is not part of our special education teachers' performance assessment. That's actually only about 15% of teachers in our force. So for our special education teachers, 65% of their assessment is based on observations, so pedagogical practice. 15% is based on student achievement, and those are teacher-set goals based on either teacher-created assessments or assessments that are modified for the general education curriculum, but we trust our teachers and principals to work together to determine what's the best fit for the students in their class. And then DCPS for decades was wildly out of compliance for providing appropriate services to our students, and there were two large lawsuits against the district. And so in order to help bring the district into compliance, our special education teachers also are assessed on two different timeliness metrics, IEP timeliness as well as eligibility timeliness. Those are each at 5%. And by including these metrics in our special education teachers' assessments, we've actually brought the district almost to 100% compliance in the last 5 years. That's another, I think, really important example. Doesn't need to be with special education, but how what you choose to value in your assessment system really does drive people's work and practice. And we see the same types of growth in our teachers in special education as we do in other groups.
Thank you. So now a broader question for both of you. What is your advice as states and districts are trying to embed new national or state standards into this work?
I'll defer to Dan for starters.
Well, I mean, I guess my advice is some of the things that I have mentioned before. I think and actually it echoes some of what Michelle's also said. First thing is, I would think very clearly about the theory of action around workforce change, and there may be multiple ways in which evaluations could affect the workforce, but the design of the system should be connected to the ways in which you want to use the evaluations and the ways in which you think it's going to affect the workforce. Second thing is, and this echoes Michelle, is that I think that this stuff is really hard, and it's hard because of the politics and the cultural change that's entailed with differentiating people. And so I would try and set up systems that where there's built-in assessment. So the evaluation of impact, and I sent the link out by Tom D. and Jim Wyckoff, is terrific, and it's really encouraging. I think that impact is an outlier when you look at evaluation reform around the country. Most new evaluation systems at least are giving the same sort of distribution that we saw in the old systems. I think politically it's really easy to say, we changed the system, declared victory, we're done. And that in and of itself is not going to impact the quality of the teacher workforce. As Michelle said, implementation is everything. So I would want to have some checks built in so that, you don't fall into that trap of saying, we changed it, everything's good. And I'll stop there.
Did you want me to chime in, or do you want to take a different question?
It's up to you. If you have anything to add, please go ahead.
No, that's fine. We can take another question.
Okay. So let's talk about observations for a bit. Something that's of a lot of concern to folks implementing observation systems is inter-rater reliability. Can you describe efforts to increase inter-rater reliability among evaluators?
I'm happy to start there. We were fortunate enough in the last couple of years to get a nice grant from the Gates Foundation to help us do just that. And for the last 2 years, we've designed an online training platform for our rubric. What we initially did was get footage from the MET studies as well as film teachers here in DCPS and find 30-minute clips of video, which then we brought our strongest evaluators together to rate. We believe that there is a best score for any particular 30-minute period of time. And so those evaluators would rate that and then come to a reconciliation call with their evidence. And so we were able to create what we call anchor scores for a massive library of videos. We then use those videos, and I use this word loosely. We don't actually in DCPS quote certify our evaluators, although if we were starting out, maybe we would. But we do constantly calibrate them using those videos. So evaluators watch those, they submit scores for those videos, and we worked with ETS, and because we have 9 standards in DCPS, our threshold, we have 2 different thresholds of performance that we're looking for our evaluators, and they represent growth for them as well. The first is that an evaluator can get within 0.5 of the anchor score. In DCPS, that would basically be putting you in the same category of performance. Our higher threshold, though, which is certainly what we're strive for our evaluators to be at before they begin their formal observations, is to have 5 of 9 scores correct and the other 4 adjacent. That means that you're actually giving the right feedback to teachers. We both looked at this lesson and we both are giving them the same score, the same feedback for example, checking for understanding. And so what this online platform does is it gives an overview to the rubric. It is modules for each one of the 9 standards, which gives an overview of that standard. It gives advice on how to collect evidence for that standard. We have found here in DCPS that more often than not, it's missing evidence that causes discrepancy in rating versus a misinterpretation of the rubric. And so really refining your evaluator's ability to collect evidence, which is really, really hard. You could turn your head and miss a question or miss a student behavior, is important. And then these modules then provide video practice for that particular standard in isolation, and then we spiral them together so that people can begin to get practice for putting them together. The folks that we have trained using the platform, so this again goes to this hindsight is 20/20 in DCPS, our new evaluators that come into the district, 100% of them are meeting that highest threshold after using our platform. We're working now with our veteran administrators because we didn't have this platform when we first rolled out the system. We didn't have this kind of robust training, and that moving backwards and recalibrating people's interpretation is more challenging, but something that by the end of this year, we'll be confident we're where we need to be. But it's very hard work.
Yes, it is. Thank you. Thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you, Dan. Thank you to all our presenters. I hope this was useful. We appreciate everyone being with us today. Please remember to fill out the survey and check our website for resources. And thank you and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks.